Wyoming, late 1870s. Dusk bled across the wind-scoured plains, a bruise of gold turning to ash. The sky hung low and heavy, and the wind, a relentless beast, howled across the dry earth as if chasing ghosts only it could see. On the edge of that vast, soul-crushing emptiness stood Wyatt Reed's ranch house, its wooden bones groaning a lonely tune against the cold. Inside, the silence was a physical presence, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. It was a silence Wyatt had cultivated, a wall he'd built brick by painful brick since the world had taken everything from him. Wyatt Reed, a man carved from the very grit and granite of the land, shifted in his chair. The ache in his joints was a more reliable companion than any person had been for years. He'd meant to stay by the fire, to let the warmth seep into his marrow and dull the phantom pains of memory. But a sharp, frantic kick from the barn, a sound of pure equine panic, shot through the wind's roar. One of the mares was spooked. He couldn't risk a broken board or a panicked animal injuring itself. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade, he pushed himself to his feet. He pulled on his heavy coat, the worn wool a familiar shroud. As he stepped outside, the wind clawed at him, trying to steal the breath from his lungs. Dust curled around his worn boots, and the wide brim of his hat flapped with each violent gust. He moved with the slow, steady gait of a man who had made a bitter peace with solitude, his steps measured and deliberate. The lantern flame shivered in its glass prison, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed across the path like specters. This land held every ghost he owned. He saw his father, his proud smile in the sturdy beams of the barn they had raised together. He felt his wife, Clara, beside him on the porch, where they used to watch the stars ignite the boundless night sky. He heard his daughter, Sarah, laughing as she chased butterflies in the very field where their graves now lay, marked by two simple wooden crosses. Since the pox had stolen them both within a fortnight, it was just him, the wind, and the dust. He had learned to prefer it that way. Company only reminded him of what he'd lost. He reached the barn, the familiar scent of hay and horse calming the disquiet in his soul. He checked the stall. A loose board, easily fixed. The mare had settled, her dark eyes still wide but trusting as he ran a calloused hand down her neck. He murmured a few soothing words, his voice rough from disuse. He turned to go back to the warmth of his empty house, but then he froze. His head snapped up, every nerve ending suddenly alight. Beneath the ceaseless howl of the wind, there was another sound. A voice, thin as a spider's thread, fragile and human. "Please, open it. I can't breathe." He turned sharply, his body tensing. The sound came from the old storage shed, a leaning, half-rotted wreck he hadn't bothered to open in months. It listed like a tired old man, ready to collapse into a pile of splinters with the next strong gust. Was it the wind playing tricks? A phantom voice conjured by his own loneliness? He raised the lantern and stepped closer, his boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt. "Please, someone. I can't." The voice was muffled, strained, and undeniably real. The wind tried to swallow it again, but he had heard enough. Wyatt's hand, moving on pure instinct, dropped to the cold, familiar weight of the revolver at his hip. He pushed open the crooked shed door. The hinges screamed in protest. The smell hit him first, a foul cocktail of dust, stale air, sweat, and something else. Something sharp and metallic. The kind of smell you remember from a battlefield or a butchering, the smell of blood and fear. He raised the lantern higher. Its light spilled across cracked shelves laden with rusted tools, old coils of rope, and then a shape near a pile of grain sacks. One of them moved. It jerked, a pathetic, spasmodic twitch. Then again. Wyatt stepped forward cautiously, his boots silent on the dirt floor. This was no mere sack. It was a person, bound head to toe in rough burlap, tied with thick rope, squirming feebly on the floor. The voice came again, hoarse and desperate, from within the sack. "Please, I can't breathe." His own breath hitched. He He set the lantern down on a crate and dropped to one knee. His calloused, trembling fingers fumbled with the tight, merciless knots. Whoever had done this meant for their victim to remain hidden, to suffocate slowly in the dark. A trap? Had someone planted her here to lure him out? His fingers hesitated for a heartbeat, but then the sack trembled with a ragged, desperate gasp for air that sounded perilously close to a final one. He worked faster, his knuckles scraping against the rough rope. The sack peeled open. The stench grew stronger. A face, a woman's, young, barely 20 maybe. Her skin was a horrifying mosaic of bruises, her lips cracked and bleeding. A filthy gag was tied brutally tight over her mouth, her head still covered. Slowly, as if handling a spooked foal, Wyatt reached out and pulled the cloth free. She coughed, a raw, scraping sound, her body convulsing with the effort to draw air into her starving lungs. Her eyes fluttered open, wide, terrified, and an impossible, piercing blue. In the flickering lantern light, they looked like shattered pieces of the sky. They locked on his. "Please," she rasped, the word broken and fragile. "Don't let them take me again." Wyatt's chest, a space long hollowed out and sealed by grief, tightened with a forgotten, painful ache. He gently pulled the rest of the sack from her head. Blonde hair, matted with sweat and dirt and blood, clung to her cheeks. Rope burns circled her wrists like brutal, unforgiving bracelets. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You're on my ranch. You're safe now." As he gathered her into his arms, the sheer lack of weight was staggering. She was a bird with broken wings. She let out a soft cry of pain but did not resist, her fingers clutching his shirt as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. He kicked the shed door shut behind them, the sound swallowed by the wind. The wind screamed, but inside Wyatt's world, a profound and terrifying silence had just been broken. It was no longer just him, the wind and the dust. Wyatt carried her into the cabin, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the chilling reality of what he'd found. He laid her gently on the cot near the hearth, the firelight flickering across her bruised face, illuminating the cruelty she had endured. For a moment he was paralyzed, the sight of her helplessness a ghostly echo of nursing Clara through her final, fever-racked days. He shook himself free of the memory's grip. This was not a ghost. This was a living, breathing woman who needed him. He moved with a quiet, forgotten urgency, his actions driven by an instinct he thought had been buried with his family. He gathered a basin of fresh water, clean cloths from a drawer, and the last of his whiskey, meant for lonely nights, now repurposed as a harsh antiseptic. Her name, she whispered, was Lydia. She shivered uncontrollably under the heavy coat he draped over her, her wide, unfocused eyes darting around the strange room. "You need to stay awake," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. He dabbed a wet cloth at a cut on her cheek. She flinched, not from the sting of the water, but from the simple, unexpected act of a gentle touch. It was clear it had been a long time since a hand had met her skin with anything but violence. He cleaned her wounds with a quiet, grim precision. When he poured whiskey over the raw, chafed rope burns on her wrists, she gasped, a sharp intake of breath that was half pain, half shock. But she didn't pull away. She just clenched her teeth, a single, silent tear spilling down her cheek, tracing a clean path through the grime. He worked in silence, his hands steady, channeling the memory of skills he'd prayed he would never need again. Hands that had buried too many, saved too few. When he finished, he pulled an old quilt from the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. As he laid it over her, a scent rose from the chest, faint lavender and cedar, the scent of Clara. It hit him like a physical blow. He paused, his hand hovering over the contents. His fingers, seemingly with a will of their own, drew out a worn wool coat, dark green with faded bone buttons. He laid it gently over the quilt, tucking it around her thin shoulders. His fingers brushed the collar, a place his wife's hair used to rest. For a breath, His stern, weathered face dissolved into a portrait of profound, hollowing grief. Lydia, drifting in and out of consciousness, saw the change. In the flickering firelight, she saw a man not just quiet and stern, but broken, haunted. He held the coat a moment too long, his thumb stroking the worn fabric, before letting it go as if it had burned him. He pulled a chair close to the cot and sat, his elbows on his knees, a silent guardian. "You don't have to stay," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Yes," he said, his gaze fixed on the mesmerizing dance of the flames. "I do." The following morning, pale light crept across the floorboards. Lydia finally spoke, her voice a raw whisper, telling a horrifying story. She was with a wagon train bound for Oregon. 3, maybe 4 men with masks had descended in the night, taking her while the others slept. They'd spoken of selling her at a saloon in Fort Rock, a place that bought unbroken girls. Shame, not tears, crumpled her face as she spoke. They'd gotten spooked on the trail, thinking they were being followed. One had struck her when she cried out, and the next thing she knew, she was suffocating in the dark. Wyatt listened, his jaw tightening until it ached. Every word was a hammer blow against the quiet solitude he had so carefully constructed. After she fell into an exhausted sleep, he stepped out onto the porch, a mug of hot coffee in his hand. The world looked the same, but it felt different, charged with a new and malevolent energy. Then he saw them. Fresh hoofprints, deep and heavy, not from his horses. They led around the barn. Following them, his breath caught. There in the dirt lay a mangy stray dog that had been hanging around for weeks, a clean bullet hole between its eyes. It wasn't a warning. It was a message, a claim. His eyes scanned the property line, and something made his blood run cold. On the trunk of the largest cottonwood tree, burned black into the bark, was a crude symbol, a stylized R with a serpent's tongue. He'd seen it years ago on bounty posters, heard it whispered in towns. The mark of the Redmouth Riders, a ruthless gang known for trafficking women across the territories. They hadn't abandoned her. They had stored her, and they would be back to collect their property. He walked fast back to the cabin, his mind racing. He found Lydia awake, sitting up on the cot, wrapped in Clara's green coat. The fear was still in her eyes, but a flicker of defiance was there too. "They were here," he said, his voice grim. "They left a message." Fear sparked in her eyes. "They know." He didn't need to answer. He grabbed a lantern and led her across the yard to the old hay shed. At the back, hidden beneath a stack of crates, was a trap door. He pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into the damp, earthy darkness. "What is this?" she whispered. "Storm cellar," he said. "My family built it. We hid here when the war came too close." He lit the lantern and held it out. "You'll stay down here. It's the only place they won't think to look." She hesitated at the edge of the darkness, the memory of the sack still fresh. "I've been locked away enough." Wyatt looked at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "This isn't a prison, Lydia. It's a shield. You said they'd come for you. I believe you." She swallowed hard and nodded, climbing down slowly. The cellar was small but dry, lined with shelves of preserved goods and an old cot. Wyatt followed her down and set the lantern on a crate. The small space felt charged with tension. "I tried to escape before," she said quietly, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Twice. The second time I made it to a stagecoach stop. They found me, said next time they'd kill me slow." She looked up at him, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know why I'm still breathing, but I want to live this time. I want to live." The words hung in the air, a raw and powerful declaration. Wyatt stepped forward. Without saying anything, he unhooked his old heavy revolver from his belt. He placed it gently on the shelf beside the cot. His hand covered hers for a moment, showing her the hammer, the trigger. "If anyone but me comes down those stairs," he said, his voice low and steady, "you shoot. Don't hesitate, don't think, just shoot." The weight of the gun in her hands was both terrifying and empowering. It was more than a weapon. It was a transfer of trust, a promise. He wouldn't let her be a victim again. He left a tin of jerky and a canteen of water beside it, then climbed the steps and closed the heavy hatch, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the sudden darkness. The hours after Lydia was secured in the cellar crawled by with agonizing slowness. Wyatt couldn't rest. He moved about the ranch like a caged wolf, every sense screaming with vigilance. He checked the sightlines from the porch, cleaned and oiled his rifle until the mechanism was flawless, and positioned his remaining horse in a stall that was hidden from the main road. Every creak of the wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the form of a man. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a sentinel, a guardian. He was protecting not just the woman in his cellar, but the last fragile ember of his own humanity. By late afternoon, the wind had calmed. The sun sank low, casting long skeletal shadows over the dry fence posts. Wyatt was mending a gate near the corral, his hands busy but his eyes constantly scanning the southern road. And then he saw it. A plume of dust, small at first, then growing steadily larger. 3 riders. They came slow and deliberate, not like men just passing through, but like men who already knew their destination. Wyatt stood straight, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He didn't reach for his rifle, not yet. He let it lean against the fence post, within easy reach. He watched them ride in, their boots heavy in the stirrups, their eyes hidden beneath the wide brims of their dusty hats. The one in the middle, a man with a cruel twist to his mouth, lifted a hand in a mock greeting. "Evenin', friend." Wyatt didn't answer. His silence was a wall, solid and unbreachable. They stopped just shy of the porch, their horses shifting and snorting in the cooling air. "We're looking for someone," the middle one said, his voice deceptively casual. "A young woman, blonde hair, might have passed this way." "She don't talk much," another added with a greasy, knowing grin that made Wyatt's stomach turn. "But she's family, owes us." Wyatt's voice, when it came, was as low and cold as a winter creek. "You her kin?" The man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Blood or bond, it don't matter to you. She's ours." Wyatt took a deliberate step forward, away from the fence and into the open. "Kin don't stuff a girl in a burlap sack and leave her to choke in a shed. Kin don't beat a woman half to death." The middleman's eyes narrowed, the friendly facade vanishing like a puff of smoke. "You're making some bold assumptions, rancher." "I saw the bruises," Wyatt said, his voice flat and hard. "I heard her beg for air. If that's family, I'd hate to see your enemies." The youngest of the 3, a boy with nervous eyes and a hand that kept twitching near his pistol, shifted in his saddle. "You best watch yourself, old man," the leader growled, his hand now resting on the butt of his own gun. "That girl belongs to us. She's property." Wyatt stepped up onto the porch, putting the high ground to his advantage. His hand came to rest on the weathered stock of the rifle. "No," he said, the single word ringing with absolute finality. "She doesn't." A tense, suffocating moment passed. The air grew thick, the only sound the nervous stamping of a horse. Then, metal whispered against leather, a gun being drawn. "Last chance, rancher," the boy snapped, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and bravado. "Turn her over, or we will." Wyatt moved faster than they could have imagined an old man could move. The rifle was at his shoulder in a blur of motion. One shot cracked the silence. Dust and gravel exploded near the lead horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming in terror, nearly throwing its rider. The 3 men jerked back, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Wyatt didn't move a muscle, the rifle steady against his shoulder, his eye sighting down the barrel. "The next one," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Won't miss." The riders backed their horses away slowly, their hands held carefully in the open. The leader's face was a mask of pure hatred. He spat again. "You'll regret this. She ain't worth dying for." Wyatt's voice stayed even. She's worth more than you." They wheeled their horses around and galloped off in a storm of dust and impotent rage, their threats swallowed by the distance. Wyatt stood still, watching the ridge until their shadows disappeared completely. Night came early, and with it, a storm. The sky over the plains turned a deep, furious black. Thunder cracked like artillery fire across the hills. Wind howled and clawed at the ranch house, rattling every window and board. Wyatt told himself the storm was good cover, but he knew it also masked the sound of their return. He found Lydia in the cellar, pale but alert when he opened the trap door. "They came, didn't they?" she asked. He nodded. "Sent them away, but they'll be back." He knew it. They knew it. Their pride had been wounded. They wouldn't just leave. The storm hit its peak around midnight. Rain pounded the roof like 1,000 angry fists. Inside the main cabin, the wind rushed down the chimney, shaking the pots on their hooks. Suddenly, a crash of shattering glass from the east wall ripped through the din. Lydia, who had crept up from the cellar for water, froze, the cup slipping from her hands. Heavy, intentional footsteps sounded inside the house. A shadow moved through the parlor. "Don't scream," a voice hissed from the darkness, "or I'll break your teeth." It was the youngest one, the one with the nervous eyes, now filled with a cruel confidence. He lunged, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her back. She hit the floor hard, the air knocked from her lungs. Dazed, she looked up into his face. "Boss says you're worth a lot," he spat. "But not if you fight." He raised a heavy boot to strike her. Something inside Lydia, a core of pure survival forged in weeks of terror, finally snapped. She didn't scream. She roared. She scrambled away, her fingers finding the handle of the small, sharp knife Wyatt had given her. The man yanked her back, but she twisted, slashing wildly. Steel cut flesh. He screamed, stumbling back, clutching his arm. She tried to rise, but he was on her again, swinging. She dodged, slashed again, feeling the blade connect. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and slammed her hard against the wall. "Stupid girl," he growled, his face contorted with pain and rage. "You think this ends with you walking free?" He raised a fist to end it. The front door burst open with a deafening crack, slamming against the inside wall. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in a stark, terrifying tableau. Wyatt stood there, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his rifle raised and steady. His eyes were not the eyes of a quiet rancher. They were the eyes of a killer. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, he fired. The report was deafening inside the small cabin. The bullet struck the intruder in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him into the stone hearth. The man groaned, clutching his wound, his eyes wide with shock. Wyatt stepped in, the rifle barrel unwavering. "Move again," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "And you'll leave here in a box." The storm raged outside. Inside the cabin, a tense silence fell, thick with the smell of gunpowder. The young rider lay groaning by the hearth, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Lydia was pressed against the wall, trembling but holding the small knife. Wyatt kept his rifle aimed at the wounded man. "Can you walk?" he asked Lydia. She nodded weakly. He helped her to her feet and laid her gently on the bed in the small bedroom. Her ankle was swelling. "Let me see," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "You did good." "I thought I was going to die," she trembled. "You didn't," he said quietly. "You're safe now." He cleaned her cuts and then turned to her ankle. From a cedar chest, he pulled out a soft, blue flannel shirt belonging to his late wife, Clara. Lydia saw the pain in his eyes. "Clara's," he murmured, tearing a strip from the sleeve. He wrapped Lydia's ankle with a firm, gentle touch. "She was everything to me," he said, looking out the window. "But you're here now, and you matter." He tied the intruder to a chair and waited for dawn. They couldn't stay. The ranch was now a target. They rode out as the first light broke. Wyatt had the wounded man tied to his horse. Lydia rode the black mare, her face set with resolve despite her throbbing ankle. The road ahead was treacherous. By midday, they stopped to rest. "If we can make it through Dry Gulch by nightfall, we'll be halfway to safer ground," Wyatt muttered. As they entered the narrow canyon, an unnatural quiet fell. Then, gunfire echoed from the walls. Wyatt cried out as a bullet struck his shoulder, and he slumped in his saddle. 2 men appeared on the ledge above, while their leader blocked the path ahead. "Thought you could run, sweetheart?" the leader sneered. Wyatt was barely conscious. In that split second, Lydia's terror was replaced by a ferocious will to protect him. She spurred her mare forward, grabbed Wyatt's reins, and bolted down a narrow cut in the gulch wall. Bullets flew past them. She pulled both horses behind a wall of stone and dismounted. Wyatt collapsed into her arms. "Stay with me, Wyatt," she whispered, dragging him behind a boulder. His face was ashen, his shirt soaked with blood. "You ride like hell," he rasped. "You're not dying," she snapped, tearing his shirt open. She poured whiskey over the wound. Wyatt hissed through his teeth. She bound his shoulder tightly, her motions firm and deliberate, just as he had done for her. For now, they had survived. He had pulled her from the darkness, and now she was holding the line for him. The sun was high in the sky by the time they cleared the gulch. Lydia helped Wyatt stay in his saddle. He was conscious but weak from his injury. They were alone and exhausted, but Lydia's resolve burned bright. Wyatt's life depended on her, and she pushed them onward. They arrived at the quiet town of Sage Hollow the next morning. It was a place on the verge of becoming a memory, but for Wyatt, it was a place where he still had a friend. He dismounted slowly, and Lydia was instantly at his side, a sturdy support. Her clothes were torn and dusty, but her eyes held a new, unyielding strength. "The sheriff's office," Wyatt said softly, leaning on her. "Cal will be there." The building was small and weathered. Inside, a broad-shouldered man with kind, sharp eyes looked up from his desk. A look of astonishment crossed his face. "Wyatt Reed," he said, his voice a low growl of surprise. "It's been a long time." "Still breathing, Cal," Wyatt managed, with a faint smile. The man, Marshal Calvin, came around the desk to help his friend. His smile faded as he saw their condition. "What trouble has found you, old friend?" Wyatt's voice was low. "I need your help, Cal." With the door bolted, Wyatt and Lydia told him everything. Lydia spoke with a quiet and unwavering voice, not asking for pity, but stating the facts of what had happened. Marshal Cal listened, his expression growing more serious with every word. When they finished, he let out a long breath. "The Redmouth Riders," he said grimly. "I've heard whispers, but we've never been able to stop them." He looked at Lydia with deep respect. "You're the first to come forward. Your courage gives us a chance to bring them to justice." He met Lydia's gaze. "Not if we stop them," she said, her voice firm. A slow, determined nod from the marshal. "They'll be looking for you. They're arrogant and won't expect a fight." He stood, his decision made. "All right. Let's set a trap and end this for good." That night they gathered at an old, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Marshal Cal and 6 deputies hid inside, their goal to capture the gang and bring them to justice. Wyatt, his arm in a sling, stood with Lydia in the shadows outside. Lydia wore a dark shawl, her head bowed, playing the part of someone who had been recaptured. Wyatt leaned on a crutch, his rifle at his side. He was not just fighting for Lydia, but for the memory of his family and for all the others who had been harmed. They waited in the cold silence. Soon they heard the sound of approaching horses. 4 riders appeared, their leader the same scarred man from before. Well, he drawled, dismounting. "Didn't expect you to make it so easy for us." "She didn't," Wyatt said, stepping forward from the shadows. "We did." The man looked confused for a second. In that moment, the warehouse doors flew open, and Marshal Cal and his deputies emerged, their rifles ready. "It's over," the marshal declared. "You're surrounded." The gang was caught by surprise. In the confusion, The scarred man lunged for Lydia, pulling her close. But Lydia didn't cower. She struggled, elbowing him hard and breaking his grip. In that clear moment, Wyatt raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The loud crack startled the man, causing him to stumble back.
Before he could recover, Marshal Cal and his deputies moved in. The confrontation was swift and decisive. The leader was apprehended, and while 2 riders escaped into the darkness, the heart of their operation was broken.
The scarred man was taken into custody. Lydia watched him go, not with triumph or satisfaction, but with a feeling of profound release. The shadow that had haunted her was finally gone. Wyatt limped to her side, his hand gently placing itself on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. She looked at him, at his tired, pained, and impossibly kind face. Her eyes filled with something new, something she hadn't felt in a lifetime. Hope. Several weeks later, the legal proceedings concluded in Fort Rock. The courtroom was crowded and tense, but when Lydia took the stand, a quiet strength filled the room. Her voice, though soft at first, grew steady and clear. With great courage, she shared her story, speaking not of fear, but of her determination to endure. Her testimony was powerful and honest. Wyatt stood beside her, his presence a solid and unwavering support. When he spoke, the room listened intently. In the end, justice, long awaited, had finally arrived. The criminal operation was dismantled, and the territories were made safer for everyone. Afterward, the district marshal offered Wyatt a position with the Rangers, saying, "We could use good men like you." Wyatt looked out toward the distant Wyoming plains. "I'm looking for a quieter life now, Marshal," he replied gently. "It's time I went home." And this time, he was not going alone. Spring arrived late in Wyoming that year, melting the snow slowly. But when the grass appeared, it was green and full of life. The world was being reborn, and so were they. One afternoon, Wyatt was on the porch, carefully mending an old rocking chair. He hummed a quiet tune, the sound of sandpaper on wood peaceful and steady. He wasn't erasing old memories, but simply making the chair strong enough to hold new ones. The front door opened, and Lydia stepped out. She was wearing a faded blue flannel shirt, the same one he had used to bandage her shoulder. Now, small, cheerful sunflowers were stitched into the sleeves, her bright thread making the fabric whole again. In her hand, she held a folded piece of paper. She walked over and placed it in his palm. It was a marriage certificate, already signed with her clear, steady signature. Her voice was as calm as the open plains before them. "We could start over," she said. "Here, together, if you want." Wyatt looked at her. He saw not the frightened woman he had rescued, but the strong person she had become. He saw her courage, her resilience, and the gentle light that had replaced the fear in her eyes. He carefully set his tools down and stood. Wordlessly, he pulled her into a long, steady embrace that spoke of shared understanding and the promise of healing. It was an embrace that said, "You are safe. You are seen. You are home." Their wedding was simple, attended by a few close friends and neighbors. There was music from a fiddle, and children threw wildflowers. As the sun set, turning the sky to gold, Lydia rode beside Wyatt on a gentle mare, her smile brighter than the morning. He leaned in close, his hand finding hers. "That first night," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "When I first heard your voice, all I could hear was pain. I thought you were just another sad story on this land." He paused, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. "But now," he said, his eyes reflecting the endless sky, "when I hear your voice, now, I hear home." Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, a real, true smile gracing her lips as she looked out at the land that was no longer a place of sad memories, but a promise of a future. Together.